Millions of people across the UK and around the world are celebrating the coronation of King Charles III. This symbolic ceremony combining religious service and pageantry currently being held at Westminster Abbey, where King Charles III has been crowned as the 40th reigning monarch. Now joining us live is author and political commentator Adam Schwartz. Adam, thank you for being with us on this special broadcast. The coronation of King Charles III, first coronation in 70 years. We have been watching the pomp and pageantry of the procession down the Mall from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey, where the King has been crowned. What is the overarching feeling of the people in the UK on this most prestigious occasion?
Well, I think much has been said in the build-up to this historic day about the constitutional aspects of the monarchy, about the appropriateness of having a hereditary monarchy in a sort of liberal representative democracy. But I think for so many people, what we are witnessing right now in front of us is really a big part of the appeal of the British royal family. I think what we call the pomp and the ceremony, as well as the traditions which have made up such a big part of the ceremony, really kind of provide a unique way of the public to engage with a big British institution in a way in which, it's quite difficult to see them doing otherwise. I think the ceremony itself was really sort of rich in symbolism and features sort of various competing themes that really reflect sort of not only British society, but the British Constitution as well. And I think that kind of plays quite a big role into how, Brits certainly view it. I think certainly we have the kind of balance between the military and the civilian roles. We have the religious and the secular aspects to it, of course, a very important role, considering that the UK is increasingly a secular society. But we also saw, Parliament playing a role as well in the ceremony. We had Penny Mordaunt in the turquoise dress, who is the leader of the House of Commons, who was symbolically sort of providing consent for Charles to sort of become king, which I think is very important for not only the British Constitution, but also the kind of history of conflict between the Crown and Parliament. So I think, as I mentioned, there are various different views in the UK about the monarchy, but I think really what we're witnessing in front of us right now is such an important part of the appeal of why a lot of people still do very much love and support the monarchy.
Absolutely, Adam. And the role of the King, as you have mentioned, is servitude. It is acts of service. Let's take a look at the man, King Charles III. He is a man of many interests and many passions. What kind of a king will he be in these modern times, bringing the monarchy into the modern world?
Well, I think that really is the key question. And of course, that is a question that was asked, after the death of his mother, the late Queen Elizabeth II. The thing about King Charles is, of course, that he was the longest reigning heir to the throne in history. He's 74 years old, and he's the oldest person ever to become the monarch. So we already have quite a bit of history of getting to know Charles, certainly compared to Queen Elizabeth, who was in her 20s when she became queen. We know that Charles has a lot of interest in terms of his activism, in terms of environmental activism, in terms of his charity work, in terms of his views about architecture. And I think, it's all as well, him having those views as the kind of heir apparent and as the Prince of Wales. But the role of the monarch is actually quite different to other members of the royal family. And I think, it's so important, especially keeping in the tradition of Queen Elizabeth, that actually the monarch maintains completely separate from politics. And actually we ensure that separation of sort of ceremonial power with kind of formal executive power held by the government. And I think really what we've seen since Charles automatically became king in October was really kind of changed in the way that Charles kind of approaches these issues. And I think he's become much more careful, but I think certainly he will be inspired by his mother in the way that she provided so much advice, of course, in private, in weekly meetings to prime ministers, but also from world leaders. So I think certainly he's going to try to follow in the footsteps of that. But I think it's also important for King Charles to kind of take a reforming role. I think the reality is that, time and attitudes have changed really since Queen Elizabeth Elizabeth became queen 70 years ago. And I think the reality is that in order to kind of maintain that support, particularly given all the drama around the royal family we've had over recent years, it's so important that that institution tries to kind of become a little bit more contemporary. So I think that really is going to be the major challenge for Charles. I think ultimately that is going to be the legacy which he leaves behind.
And Adam, with the people of the UK at the moment reeling under this cost of living crisis at the moment, is King Charles a leader who has a keen understanding of the people that he is now reigning over as king?
Well, I think it's a very important aspect that you've raised. And as you mentioned, we are in a historic cost of living crisis with so many people suffering and not having enough money to provide sort of, basic utilities. So I think, certainly that is recognized. And even though what we've seen today has been very, very grand in terms of anything that we've seen in terms of ceremonies, over the last sort of 70 years, the reality is that it was still, sort of reduced in terms of what it could have been. And actually compared to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, actually it is quite a reduced role. But I think, certainly after today, I think we're going to have to see, the royal family recognize that, of course, this is, quite different times, and these aren't prosperous times, and a lot of people are struggling. And actually, for a lot of people today, what they see in front of them will be quite different, of course, to their own experiences. Now, of course, we can talk about an appropriate balance between how much, money you put into the royal family and compared to, what you do for the kind of rest of the country. But I think, certainly, considering the fact that this has been scaled down in some way, there is some recognition, at least, that, we are in quite different economic times. And therefore, the way that these ceremonies have to be conducted really has to reflect that and reflect the attitudes and the feelings of the rest of the country.
Absolutely. And we also saw some firsts in this coronation of King Charles with representatives from a diverse range of religions coming to the coronation and being involved in the service. Take us through the significance of having this kind of representation of religions from all around the world.
Well, I think you rightly draw attention to, a very important aspect of this coronation, in the sense that it's tried to make the traditions and the sort of customs a little bit more contemporary than they used to be. And I think that, there is no exact standard prescribed sort of timetable for a coronation. So really with every coronation, it should become a little bit more contemporary. And really the major challenge for modernization is how you try to balance those competing themes, as I mentioned, with more modern times. So for example, we had various different religions recognized during the ceremony. We had, even members of different religions, leaders, actually give various different readings, which I think was quite an important role, even though, of course, the ceremony was mostly deep in sort of Christian ritual. But I think there were other aspects of modernization that were quite important as well. For example, for the first time, you had other UK languages take a role in the ceremony. You had sort of the Irish languages and the Welsh languages, which sort of recognizes that actually English is not only the kind of dominant language, not the only language that kind of has legitimacy in the UK. But I think it's also, so important to recognize that I think one of the things that makes today quite unique compared to other sort of royal family ceremonies around the world is the fact that actually King Charles is not just head of state of the UK, but actually of 16 different nations. So I think really, as we get to see the kind of ceremony and the procession back to Buckingham Palace after this ceremony, we will see that, sort of elements of the Commonwealth will come into that procession, and we'll have different people involved from all the 16 different realms, as they're called.
Right. And of course, with the crown comes the baggage of colonialism. What are British citizens saying with regards to this in the relevance of the monarchy?
think it's quite divided, to be honest. I think there are certainly, people who want to, draw attention to the fact that, the monarchy actually is essentially a relic from a previous time when we had sort of absolutist monarchy. Now, of course, the monarchy no longer really has sort of functional executive power, but the reality is that it still does play an important constitutional role in the UK. And I think, indeed, for many people around the world, and of course for many people in former British colonies, of course in India included, the British family is, in their minds, synonymous with British imperialism. Now, as I mentioned, the British royal family is no longer really in charge of what happens in the UK, or certainly not in terms of foreign policy or other policies. But the reality is that the wounds in those countries, in terms of national economic divisions, in terms of social aspects, are still very much present in a lot of those societies. So I can completely sort of understand how people around the world may have very mixed feelings, certainly compared to Brits when they actually look at the royal family today. I think ultimately it's not something that really does play a huge role in the kind of discourse, unfortunately, in the UK. I think the predominant view is mostly that actually the royal family today doesn't represent those kind of colonial aspects. But I think certainly that's something that the UK could be doing a lot more in terms of trying to reconcile that kind of terrible past of imperialism with actually what should be a much more modern institution today.
Right, and Adam, let's take a look at some of the traditions that we just saw during this ceremony. Will you take us through what we saw in terms of the recognition, the oath, the anointing of the new king, and the investiture, as well as, of course, the enthronement?
Absolutely. So I think one of the first, things it's important to recognise is that, of course, the UK monarch is not only the head of state, but also the head of the Church of England. Of course, when the Protestant sort of faith emerged out of Catholicism after Henry VIII appeared. So that's why, the ceremony was so rich in kind of Christian ritual, because it's such an important side to the monarchy that actually that takes place in terms of that. But I think, you had, lots of different symbolic items which really represent the crown, but also the traditions of the crown as well. You had the throne of Edward going back about 700 years, which of course is an important part to kind of maintain that aspect of continuity. As I mentioned, you had Penny Mordaunt, who is the leader of the House of Commons, who essentially almost provided sort of consent in what she was doing in terms of providing various sort of bits of equipment to Charles to indicate that actually this is a reconciliation between Parliament and the Crown. And, for those who know English history, the Parliament and the Crown had lots of divisions in the sort of 17th century that ultimately ended up in a civil war. And that's really why we seek to kind of involve so many different parties involved in this ceremony, because it's viewed as a sort of reconciliation of our previous past, when actually those divisions between sort of elected power and what you consider the kind of divine power of kings and queens, really coming together in the ceremony to kind of move forward. So, I'd say it was mostly sort of Christian ritual that led the ceremony. But again, you saw different traditions emerge as well. One tradition that's become, or aspect of the ceremony that was quite controversial, is the fact that Archbishop Welby asked or invited the public to pledge their allegiance to King Charles. Now, it's worth saying that that ultimately comes from a tradition where previously it was just the British aristocracy who would pledge their allegiance to the crown during that ceremony. So the idea behind that was actually, if we ask the rest of the public to do that, that sort of democratizes it. It tries to sort of reduce the class aspects of that tradition. But I think that ultimately was quite badly received in a way that probably wasn't anticipated, because it's sort of viewed as, I think to some aspects, sort of quite un-British, in the sense that British patriotism tends to be quite understated. We're not quite like the United States, where school children pledge allegiance to the flag every single day. So I think that was probably the most controversial aspect of the whole ceremony. But I say, there were other aspects that were much more traditional, in keeping with really the ceremonies that have taken place over the last 1,000 years or so.
Adam, thank you very much. We'll leave it there. Thank you for all your valued insights on all the latest on the coronation of King Charles III.